Hello, welcome to Spread Book Joy. Today I want to talk to you all about audiobooks. If you're new to the channel, I'm Jack and I like to talk about my own reading, but I also like to recommend great books for children for home or school because I'm a qualified teacher and I kind of do that midweek. But today Saturdays I like to publish videos where I ramble on about my own reading, and a lot of my reading in the last few years has been by audiobook, and I absolutely love audiobooks and I don't think I could live without them anymore really, so I just want to talk about those. Might be a bit of a rambly video because I was going to do the audiobook tag and I had a little look at that, but I also just want to talk to you about my favourite audiobooks and my thoughts on them. So yeah, might be a bit mismatched, but we'll see how we get on. So I started listening to audiobooks about 7 years ago. I got an Audible account, and the reason I did that was because I started learning to knit and crochet, and I found that I couldn't do that without looking at the knitting and the crochet. So I could watch TV, but I missed a lot of TV. And I could listen to podcasts and things like that, but it just occurred to me that maybe I want to listen to an audiobook, and so I downloaded Audible and I got the monthly one credit a month subscription from Audible, who obviously are not sponsoring this because I've got very few subscribers. I'm not at that level. I just like using Audible, and so I started getting their 1 credit a month membership, and it took me a while to get into listening to audiobooks. It's good if you're doing something. At the time it was very good for when I was doing crocheting and knitting, so I had to concentrate on these things, so I could just listen to the story and concentrate on that a little bit better because I was just sitting there crocheting or knitting. I wasn't doing anything else. And first of all I downloaded some quite big chunky fiction books. I dove straight in there, found that didn't really work for me to start with because I like to savour what I'm reading, and I found it really hard to follow a long story, or if my mind drifted and it was a complex story, it was a bit tricky. So I thought, well, maybe it's not for me. And then I thought, well, actually it may be the type of book that I'm going for, because I do like to listen to podcasts and I like to listen to people talking about various things. So maybe I'll try some non-fiction, maybe some biography. So I did. I started off, I thought I'll buy a biography and see how it goes, and that was great. Actually, I think it's almost a better way to consume a biography than reading it, because especially if the person reads their own work, if it's an autobiography and the person gets to read their own work. So I've got a shout out for some of those that I absolutely love, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But then the other part of it was non-fiction books, because I do like to listen to or read a lot of non-fiction to do with self-development, personal development, to do with productivity and creativity, or anything that strikes my fancy really. So I've also got books that are history books, or anything that I feel that's interesting to me non-fiction wise actually works really well on audio for me. So then I started listening to audiobooks everywhere. I started listening to audiobooks in the car, I started listening to audiobooks when I'm driving, cooking, doing chores around the house, and actually made me want to do chores because then I could listen to a bit of my book. So then I started delving back into fiction, and I've made some discoveries. So first of all, I'm a rereader. So if you are a rereader, try rereading something in audio format, because you get a different reading of it, a different interpretation of it, and quite often a brilliant performance if you've got a really good audiobook narrator. And it just kind of gives you another aspect to the story, which I find really, really enjoyable. And secondly, if you're going to listen to fiction, first person narration fiction works really, really well, because it's kind of like the autobiographies or biographies or whatever, where someone's talking at you about their life and their experience, and I find that works brilliantly. So if you've not tried audiobooks, or if you've tried them and thought they're not for me, because you did what I did, which was go in for a huge story with lots of characters, the kind of books that I like to read. If you're kind of, do what I did, then it can be a bit of a failure to start with. But I would suggest trying one of the things that really got me into audiobooks and got me to really value them. But the other part of it is that I find the older I get, the less inclined I am to read at night, because I literally fall asleep after 1 or 2 pages. But I will put on my audiobook and listen for 15 minutes, and you can set a timer for it to go off so that, if you do fall asleep, it doesn't just play all night or whatever. And it's a really good one for me because I am a bit of an insomniac, and if I wake up in the middle of the night, I can't really have anything with lights on to wake my partner up. So I'll just pop my headphones in and listen to a bit of a story. And so, yeah, audiobooks have become a real necessity in my life. The other part of it is if I'm reading a book and I'm loving the book and I haven't got time to sit down and physically read, I've always got time during any given day to listen to an audiobook. So quite often I'll get the book in several different formats, and in the Kindle version and the audiobook version, so that I can just switch from format to format. And Audible's really handy for that, because if you use Amazon, the dreaded Amazon, I know they're not the only people out there to provide ebooks and audiobooks, but that's what I've started with, and that's where my biggest collection of things are. But Audible and Kindle hook up, like they've got Whisper Sync for voice, which basically means you can switch from Kindle to audiobook and it will match up with where you were, which is really handy. You can also download audiobooks, and I listen to a lot of them through Libby, the library app. That's been a godsend in the pandemic for me, and a really great place to find audiobooks because, they're expensive. An Audible membership, I think the annual membership is quite good value, and I switched up to an annual membership because they released the Harry Potter books and I wanted all of them all at once. So rather than waiting for 1 month, 1 credit, I just switched to an annual membership, and you get like 24 credits all at once to spend. And I really use my annual credits as wisely as I can. Like if an audiobook's less than £10, I'll consider buying it rather than using a credit. But what I would say is, if you are short on cash, the library app, Libby, godsend to me. I really love the library app. If you're in the UK as well, the BBC Sounds app is brilliant because you can listen to generally abridged but sometimes dramatised versions of audiobooks, and the BBC Book at Bedtime is always wonderful, usually an abridged version of a book, but like usually a famous actor reading the book, and it's really useful and really lovely. Authors reading their own work can have some success, but sometimes not, and sometimes you might not get along with a narrator. That's another reason why some people get put off audiobooks. Narrators sometimes don't read the books out or don't pronounce things properly. Sometimes a narrator will mispronounce a word, and that will just stick in your sort of craw a little bit, and but if they're reading the rest of the book beautifully, you just have to kind of get over it. But there are some narrators that I just can't listen to, and they narrate some of my favourite books, unfortunately. But it's just one of those things. Authors reading their own work. Bill Bryson, one of my absolute favourite authors. I just don't find him a really good narrator. He's got a really kind of quiet, softly spoken voice. But there are versions of his books read by an actor called William Roberts, and he's really good. In fact, he just makes the books really, really funny. So that's a case where actually the author reading their own work really doesn't work, but the narrator change there was really good. An author who doesn't read his work well as well, Stephen King, I'm afraid. Not a good narrator of his own work, but I did like his narration of On Writing, which is his non-fiction work, but to narrate his fiction, not very good at all, in my opinion. One author who reads his work really, really well is Neil Gaiman. I can highly recommend him reading his own work. He's got a great rich voice, and I think he's brilliant. And the best audiobook of one of his is the adaptation of The Sandman that was released on Audible last year. It's got a full cast. James McAvoy plays Morpheus, who's the god of dreams, and then you've got Kat Denning, Riz Ahmed, Michael Sheen. You've got like a whole cast of like superstars narrating this story. Neil Gaiman's like the main narrator, and they just dramatise and act out the parts because it's originally a graphic novel. But loved that so much, and it's not for the faint-hearted, because if you're not familiar with the Sandman graphic novels, it's quite twisted. And quite shocking in places, but I absolutely loved it. But another great Neil Gaiman audiobook, which is dramatised on the BBC radio, because some of these things I'm going to tell you about, they are dramatisations of books, so they're not necessarily the just audiobook. But it's The Sleeper and the Spindle, and it was dramatised on the BBC, starring Gwendolyn Christie from Game of Thrones. And The Sleeper and the Spindle is actually a really good Pride Month recommendation, because it's a subversion of the traditional fairy tales, where we've got Sleeping Beauty and Snow White. The fairy tales kind of converge, and a soldier queen goes to wake the sleeping princess. So it's a really good LGBTQ plus book for Pride Month as well. The books that I love the absolute most are the Harry Potter books read by Stephen Fry. I don't need to talk to you about Harry Potter, Stephen Fry either. I shouldn't need to talk to you about either of those, but he is hands down one of the best narrators ever. He could narrate the phone book and I would listen to it. He manages to give every single character, and there are dozens and dozens of characters in those books, their own distinct way of speaking and voice. And there's a really, really funny story that he started narrating them before they were actually really very the huge phenomenon that they did become. And he narrated the first book, and he was sent to meet J.K. Rowling in to meet her and talk to her about her book, and she told him she was writing the sequel, and he was like, "Oh, well done, good for you," kind of a little bit patronising. And he had a real trouble with saying a particular phrase in the book, and it was about Harry's wand, and the phrase was Harry pocketed it, pocketed the wand, and he couldn't say it, and he just take after take after take. So she managed to put that in every single Harry Potter book because she knew he'd be narrating all of them, which I thought was actually quite funny. But yeah, brilliant books. I listen to them, they're a real comfort listen for me, and yeah, just brilliantly done. In terms of other fiction, I absolutely love, and it's a first person narration, Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. Brilliant book anyway, and I had read the book prior to listening to it. So audiobook wasn't my first read, it was a reread for me. But yeah, that works really, really well. If you've not heard of the book before, I'm sure most people have, it's all the story told from the point of view of Eleanor Oliphant, who is quite an unconventional character, but she's narrating the story. She's got a lot of issues, she hasn't got many friends, and as the story progresses we find out that she's got a lot of trauma in her life. And yeah, it's a really fantastic book, just brilliant. I also highly recommend listening to a classic. Classics generally get narrated by really famous actors. One of my favourites is 20th century classic To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a great book anyway, but the narration by Sissy Spacek is just amazing. It's just, her voice just brings you into the story, absolutely brilliant. Rosamund Pike does some great narration for Jane Austen, and I think it's Sense and Sensibility, the last one I listened to. And there's a brilliant version of Anne of Green Gables, which is narrated by Rachel McAdam. McAdam, can't remember. I'll put it up on the screen. That was really, really well done. In terms of biographies, I like a music biography, I like a comedian's biography, I like actors' biographies, autobiographies I'm talking about, and when they read their own work, it's like they're just telling you their life story. So I really, really loved several. How Not to Be a Boy by Robert Webb, Truths, Half-Truths and Little White Lies, narrated by Nick Frost. Oh, Michael J. Fox is one of his many autobiographies. He's got quite a few now, but I really enjoyed that. I'm a huge Michael J. Fox fan. Back to the Future, one of my favourite films of all time, and I loved him so much when I was younger. So yeah, Michael J. Fox's autobiography, well worth a listen. Tina Fey's one, Bossy Pants, and equally Amy Poehler's book, Yes Please. I really enjoyed those, and yeah, they're hilarious people, so yeah, they're always very enjoyable listens when you listen to a comedian's. In fact, I've just mentioned loads of comedians there as well. But yeah, they're always really well worth listening to. They're funny and insightful, and you just get to see how hardworking these people actually are and how they've become successful. And I always find those stories really fascinating. Shout outs to some other non-fiction. Adam Buxton's Ramble book. You might not know him if you're not from the UK. Adam Buxton was a comedian. It does an amazing podcast, and he released his Ramble book, which is full of just talks about his father died and his perspective on that, but it's also interspersed with his memories from growing up and various sketches and skits that he does. In fact, I think the audiobook was released back during the pandemic last year, and it was released ahead of the traditionally physical published book, which I think is the first time something like that has been done. But he wanted to release it for people to listen to during the pandemic, and it really made me laugh out loud. And it was also really poignant and touching as well, because it was about his time with his father just before his father died. But yeah, loved that book. Equally, another one that's really important to me, non-fiction, is Reasons to Stay Alive by Matt Haig. Yeah, I've not read it physically, I've only ever listened to it, and I've listened to it several times because it's the sort of book that is a comfort, and it rewards you'll go back to it because it gives you something, gives you advice, and if you've ever suffered from anxiety and depression, I'd highly recommend that book. I also absolutely loved Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. She narrates it herself and she's just got a really pleasant speaking voice. Big Magic is all about creativity, and it's if you're a writer or if you're a creator of any kind, or you're just into the idea of art and creativity, it's well worth listening to. I'm sure there are plenty of other videos out there will tell you brilliant reviews of it, but yeah, it's a good audiobook. And finally, what I love to do is reread books. One thing that I was really disappointed in, I have listened to all of the audiobooks, but was the George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, which most people know as Game of Thrones, which is just the first book, A Game of Thrones. It's narrated by Roy Dotrice, and it's done so... when the audiobook narrator just completely changes the people's accents, when he forgets, like at one point, I can't remember who it was, not Tyrion Lannister, his dad, Tywin Lannister, completely changed his accent at one point through these massive books. They're like 50 plus hours, some of them, and he just completely changes his accent. Tyrion and Cersei and Jaime Lannister all have different accents, despite the fact that they're all siblings and you'd presume were brought up in the same place. Yeah, so things like that really kind of get to me and take you out of the story. That's why I dislike it. The Discworld books, Terry Pratchett's Discworld, I am listening to them, but I don't like the narration. They were recorded a long time ago, so the quality of the recordings isn't that great as well. So Tony Robinson narrates the abridged versions. I don't like abridgments anyway, really, if I can help it, but I try not to choose the abridgments where possible. The full-length books, the earlier ones, are narrated by Nigel Planer, and he again does that thing where the accent choices are a bit strange and the pronunciation of words is a bit strange, and he changes things and chops and changes things halfway through, which shows a lack of care and attention to the source work, in my opinion. Sorry, that bell ringing was my cat jumping off a table. But I also just really, it takes me out of the story, unfortunately. There are several other narrators. If you do want to listen to really good Discworld audio, I'd really suggest there's on Audible, and it must be available elsewhere as well, there's a collection of the BBC dramatisations. They are abridgments because they're dramatisations, they're not the full text, but they're full cast dramatisations that were broadcast on the BBC, and you've got Mort, Weird Sisters, Small Gods, Night Watch, and a couple of others, I think Eric. But yeah, I love that because it's just a really good listen, really good fun. There's also a really great dramatisation from the BBC of Lord of the Rings available on Audible, but also the full-length books of Lord of the Rings on Audible are just narrated amazingly well. So yeah, if you want to listen to anything classic, if you want to get into audiobooks and you're not quite sure, try a favourite classic. Hopefully you'll get on with the narrator, and I'm sure you'll be swept away in the story. It's just a lovely way of re-experiencing the story, in my opinion. And if you are a fantasy fan, one of my favourite audiobook reads, is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. It's narrated by Rupert Degas, or Degas. Sorry, I can't pronounce it properly. I suspect it's Degas, like French, but I might be wrong. And he narrates that brilliantly. And again, it ticks that box that it's a first-person narration, because The Name of the Wind is the main character, Quoth, telling his story, his life story. Just have to give you a caveat if you've never heard of it or read it before. It's an as yet unfinished, supposed to be a trilogy, but we'll see. I don't know how he's going to finish this whole series in one book. But the first book is just brilliant anyway. It's one of my favourite fantasy books, and I have reread it via audio and found it brilliant. And also a shout out to Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy books. They are read by Stephen Pacey, and he does a brilliant job. I absolutely love it, apart from one word that he constantly mispronounces. And instead of saying grimace, which I'm sure is the way to pronounce it, you know, when you grimace, someone grimaces, he keeps saying grimace, the character grimaced, which is kind of irritating. However, that is literally the only flaw in it, because I actually really like everything else that he does with that book. So yeah, those are my favourite audiobooks. I'm sure I'm going to think of far more after this. I actually could talk about audiobooks for a long time. I've got over 300 now since I started collecting them on Audible, and yeah, I just find it has increased my enjoyment of reading and the amount that I read. And for all those people out there, because apparently there are people out there who don't consider it reading, what are you like? It is reading. You've consumed the book, you've had the story. Granted, it's someone else's interpretation of how it should be read, but that's just a performance. So don't listen to people who say that audiobooks aren't reading. They are reading. And if you were someone who is sight impaired, how insulting to say that you don't read if you listen to audiobooks. Just think audiobooks are wonderful and a great way into reading for people who don't necessarily want to physically read as well, or can't physically read. There are some great audiobook booktube channels, and I've only searched them recently when I searched for the audiobook tag, and I found some really, really good ones with some brilliant recommendations that I've already put on my wish list. And I tell you else who really recommends good audiobooks is Liz from Booking Out Loud. She quite often recommends really good audiobooks, and yeah, well worth checking her channel out for audiobook recommendations. So, what are your favourite audiobooks? Let me know in the description box below, and if you liked this rambling nonsense, please click like and consider subscribing for more of this rambling nonsense, and hopefully I'll see you again here soon. Bye!